Alright, hello again to anyone watching these Kaijudo videos. Today I am continuing on with the Eye of the Storm set review. So we are starting off with the darkness cards, going through the commons through rares. So I will begin here with Anguish Haunt. So 2 mana, 3000 power. At the end of each of your turns, if this creature attacked, you banish one of your creatures. So this card kind of functions like a Gigabolver-esque card, Marrow Ooze, Sickly Larva, Dream Pirate, those kinds of effects. So it can be used sort of to enable cards with banished abilities the turn they enter play. Giant things like Gregoria's Fortress or even Boran. Traditionally, you could use something like a Dream Pirate, attack with it the turn you play Fortress, and then you can trigger the Fortress's effect, and that can do some cool stuff. Anguish Haunt can do that as well, where you can attack with it the turn that Fortress comes down. The difference is it's a little bit worse in those spots, just because with the blockers that can attack and die, those Marrow Ooze style cards, those cards can trigger it mid-combat, or mid-turn especially, which is really relevant with things like Boran especially, and even Gregoria's Fortress. You could kill something to maybe kill a blocker to free up another attack or something along those lines. Whereas, or with Boran, especially if you have like an Infernal Taskmaster out, you can trigger that with something like a Marrow Ooze, and then start going off with some kind of combos with Boran. So Anguish Haunt coming at the end of the turn with its effect makes it a little bit worse for those kinds of synergies. But the difference here with Anguish Haunt is it can also destroy cards that themselves have when they're destroyed abilities, as opposed to all those Marrow Ooze style cards where they destroy themselves. So that can be relevant for triggering things like Ghost Spy the turn that card is cast. So you could just play Ghost Spy, attack with Anguish Haunt, and then at the end of the turn banish the Ghost Spy, and then discard opponent's card, draw a card of your own. So it can be used for that. Whereas traditionally, if you wanted to trigger that Ghost Spy, you would have to play it, have it stay in play, and then maybe use something like a Ripper Reaper to banish it off and get its effect. So Anguish Haunt can do those effects right away, where, I mean, yeah, it's a lot harder to pair those kinds of cards with something else to destroy them in the same turn, because usually that involves a lot of mana, whereas Anguish Haunt is already in play. So that's kind of the benefit, but I don't really see that being particularly viable, just because when you look at cards like Ghost Spy, they're not really the card that's doing the heavy lifting. It's more so like you take a powerful card with a powerful effect, like maybe Overlord Sargon or Ripper Reaper, like I mentioned, where they have powerful effects that require banishing creatures. So you look for ways to make that banishing your own creature effect less of a downside, and that's why you would play something like Ghost Spy. It's not really the other way around, where you're looking to trigger Ghost Spy, because Ghost Spy has such a powerful, when it's banished, like that's not really the case. Its banished ability is good, but it's not really good enough that you're actively looking for ways to banish it off in the same respect as you are. It's more just you're trying to enable and find fuel and good fodder for cards like Ripper Reaper. So it doesn't necessarily go that direction. So Anguish Haunt, you're not like using it to facilitate these kind of broken or any busted, like when they're banished effects, in my mind at least. So I don't know if there's really anything super powerful here, but I mean it's a really cool card to exist, just because it does something a little more unique than a lot of other cards in the game, which I think I like. Like you could build some more. I don't think it's going to be a particularly competitive card, but again, it's a unique effect that doesn't really exist exactly in this way with the card pool that we have so far in Kaijudo. So maybe you could build like a cool deck that involves maybe something like Solstice the Charmer, which is a Vortex card that has like the reinforce ability, where you look at the top. Oh crap! I forget if it's 3 or 5. I think it's 3. You look at the top 3. Any creatures, you put them in your hand. So rather than just playing good cards like Broodmother, you could play Solstice the Charmer and then play Anguish Haunt to turn that Solstice into a reinforce. But of course, as we're seeing this, like those kind of synergies are cute, but they're not really that powerful, especially in the face of other cards that exist. Like you might as well just play reinforce. So I don't know if really the effects and synergies are really there for Anguish Haunt, even with cards like Ghost Spy and Solstice existing, and probably some other cards I'm not really mentioning. But I don't think it's going to be a great card, but it's nice to exist, like I said. Next up, we have Erupting Caveworm. So 7 mana, 6,000 power Slayer. Each time it's banished or would be banished, you may put it on top of your deck instead. So this card is completely horrible. Yeah, I don't see the appeal at all. I think half the time it dies, you wouldn't even want to put it on top of your deck. Like, you would just rather go to the graveyard so you don't have to draw it the following turn. So I don't really see the appeal here. Giant Slayer is kind of counterproductive anyway, or not counterproductive, but kind of irrelevant almost. I mean, it's not huge. Like, at 6,000 power, it's pretty small, but for a 7-cost creature. So yeah, this card is just not good at all. I don't even know if there's anything combo based that you could exploit. Like, if there's some way you could keep recurring it off the top of your deck or something, I was thinking like maybe you would go with some Boran direction where maybe there's some way you could like infinitely recur it with a Boran, but the problem is it never actually banishes itself, so you can't really abuse it for any real synergies, like, because it doesn't even trigger the Boran itself when it dies. So I was all those kind of combo synergies to try to maybe do that infinitely so you can get some other kind of trigger happening. They just aren't even possible because it never actually gets banished, which is where a lot of triggers come from. So I really don't know. Maybe there's some like hidden combo with this card, but I don't know. Normally when I see a trash card, you might just dismiss it, but I feel like there's some weird effect here that maybe there's some kind of potential for abuse, at least in a kind of casual way, but I don't even see that. So the card just looks like straight garbage. Graveyard Tunneler. When it attacks, you clash and can potentially return creatures from your discard pile to your hand. So a fine effect, but not really going to see any play in any competitive decks. Maybe some casual Rotworm decks could pick this up as an option at the very least, but yeah, not something I'd be looking to play. Mad Moulder, same kind of deal, 3 mana, 3,000. This is just a straight up vanilla. Cute art though, interesting stuff, weird. So the next card we have Master of the Graves. So the next in the cycle of 8 mana, 6k double breakers. If you have 2 or more creatures in your discard, tap 4 or fewer mana to summon this creature. So this card seems actually pretty easy to use. I feel like, I don't know if there's a great home. Again, these kinds of cards are, I think, a little bit too underwhelming for full-on competitive Kaijudo to really see a place. But if there's any home for this, I think it's Mono Dark Rush. Just because you're filling your graveyard with things like at least have the option to fill your graveyard with things like Marrow Ooze and Gigerbolver, and that Mono Dark, especially compared to the Fire and Light Rushes, it just doesn't actually have access to like the quality of evolution creatures. Like, if you were looking for like a more robust threat, Master of the Graves might be actually the best option. So I could see that, because I mean, when I was talking about Haven's Council in the light review, I talked about the benefits of having this 8 mana but 4 mana card, like the ability to get around Bone Blades or have this kind of threat that gets around Bone Blades and Gloom Hollow and things like that can be a really big benefit, because you could compare it to, I forget the name, Chimera Tyrant or something like that. There's already like the 4 mana 6,000 power double breaking Chimera, and when it wins a battle you have to banish it. Like, that card could be okay, but the fact that it's 4 mana in the face of Bone Blades just makes it really tough to justify using if you were looking for that kind of effect. But maybe Master of the Graves is good enough, and I feel like it's easy enough to turn on as well. You could even play just Vicious Coffers in your deck, and that could pretty consistently turn this card on. And Vicious Coffers would also play well with Scavenging Chimera. So I could see a build that plays a little bit harder into the graveyard, because I mean, rather than, like, I would usually play things like Locomotivator in my rush deck for a little bit of extra card draw, but you could move to Vicious Coffers pretty easily instead, because I mean, it does play really well with Scavenging Chimera, like I just mentioned, because Scavenging Chimera, I mean, you're only attacking to really recur like the 1-drop set of attacked, but Vicious Coffer can fuel that card even better. It also fuels things like Return from Beyond if you want to play that with some more shield blast heavy stuff with time loss phantom, which is kind of the build of mono dark I like. So I could definitely see slotting Master of the Graves into that kind of deck. The next card here, Phantom Necromancer, Spectre, 6 mana, 2000 power shield blast creature. And when it enters, your opponent chooses a creature in your discard pile and you return that creature to your hand. So your opponent has a choice. So if you're looking for this as just a recursion tool, none of which have really been mainstay playable cards in Kaijudo, Dark Return and even Nightmare Helix, if I was looking for this kind of effect, would be my go-tos for any kind of like controlling deck. So I don't really see Phantom Necromancer being playable in that space because not even those cards see play. It's just not really what the game ended up being about as far as Kaijudo was concerned. You'd rather just play more top-end threats and stuff like that. It's less about like just kind of incremental value. So this card, I think similar to the last one, the one place I could see it would be in Mono Dark Rush, or like the Mono Dark, especially the Time Loss Phantom variants, because I was looking for a lot of Shield Blast creatures to play in that deck, and Phantom Necromancer could be one of the better ones because, again, it does play well. If you're going to go this graveyard direction, it can rebuy those 1-drops to your hand. It can rebuy stuff that you've milled with Vicious Coffers if you want to play that. So I don't know how this all would fit. And of course, part of the problem with those Time Loss Phantom Shield Blast heavy variants is you end up with a little bit more of a brickiness to your deck because you're just so full of these more expensive Shield Blast creatures. I mean, you're not super full. Like, you're playing maybe Jokos, and you could play Phantom Necromancers, but you don't even have to go that hard on Time Loss Phantom anyways. You could just play Bone Blades as removal, Joko and Necromancer, and then I'm probably forgetting the other cards. Maybe Return from Beyond to pair with some of the other synergies. Maybe not. Maybe that gets cut if you want to make sure your deck is creature heavy enough to consistently mill 2 creatures off of Vicious Coffers so that you can consistently play your Master of the Graves. So I think this card is definitely an option for that kind of deck because when you blast out a creature with Time Loss Phantom as a rush deck, it's so powerful. And having one that can be a +1 as well to get you fuel to maybe set up an evolution creature or maybe or just easily, like, because your opponent's going to have the choice again. Your opponent has a choice, so they'll probably give you like the underwhelming 1-drop. Maybe it is kind of annoying too if you're playing this Shield Blast creature heavy variant where if you mill a Joko off of Vicious Coffers, they're always going to give you that, so you don't actually get a creature you can put into play. But that's still not like the biggest deal because I mean you still get a +1, like you still get a mana card, which can be nice if you're trying to curve up to 4, especially to play those Master of the Graves. So I could definitely see that kind of archetype. It also, like, if you're gonna go play the I forget the name of this one too, the 2 mana 4000 power that when it attacks and you have to discard a card, like if you're gonna go that route as well, because that's such a high power 2-drop, they can attack through a lot of blockers, that card would be an option. And then Necromancer can, if you're able to blast it out, or if your opponent blasts it out for you, then you can get back some of those cards you've discarded, and then the cards you discarded also enables the Master of the Graves. So I feel like that could be a whole package for this kind of Mono Dark Rush that might give it a little bit of a facelift if you want to explore that archetype. Those 2 cards in particular. Spell Rend here, pretty interesting card. So your opponent reveals their hand, and you choose a spell from it, and your opponent discards that card. So I think the comparison here would pretty easily be Mindwreck Moth, which is the 3 mana 1000 with this effect. This card, I think I'm kind of a fan of it, but I don't know if it would really be worth playing too often. So the key strength of this card is that going second, it can get under your opponent's mesmerizes. So like the key place you'd be looking at for this card is in like the pile mirror matches, where it gives you more, like that matchup. It can be a lot about mesmerizing and trying to pick apart your opponent's crystal memory packages, try to pick away the reverberates and mana storms that they're trying to set up. Their skull shatters, pick away those so they can't play towards them in the late game. So Spellrand is like, could be a key card to put you ahead in that sort of discard arms race. And it would also give you the option to even take the line of going second, which is usually something you just can't afford to do in large part because Mesmerize exists. But if you have Spellrend, you can maybe afford to go that direction, which is something that Mindwreck Moth wouldn't really offer you. So that might enough be a wrinkle that makes this card better than Mindwreck Moth. Of course, if you're ever playing like more mid-rangey deck that has that might be a little less focused on that kind of positioning, where you're trying to leverage your memories and protect your memories from your opponent's crystal memories and stuff, or from their opponent's discard. And that game is very much like a pile mirror match kind of game. If you're playing a more mid-rangey deck and you want this kind of effect, you'd probably play Mindwreck Moth. But I think there's potential here. I don't know if I feel like part of the problem is like Mindwreck Moth is kind of hard to evaluate because it never really got its shot in Kaijudo as a whole. Unfortunately, it existed in, like, I always felt like it was a pretty decent card, but it existed in a Kaijudo format of standard where they're just, I mean, most decks in the metagame were playing Broodmother and light evolutions, and they were very creature heavy. Like, you maybe saw like somewhere in the range of like 3 to 5 spells max in a lot of decks, right? And it would be like maybe just playing 3 Terror Pits or whatever. Like, that would generally be it. Like maybe 3 Pits and a Mesmerize. So cards like Mindwreck Moth just weren't effective cards in the standard format. So I don't know how well they translate to open, because open has a lot of that kind of thing too. Just because those Broodmothers and creature decks in general are so powerful. Everyone is pushed to play, like, spells are so punished by Keeper of Laws and Cyber Scamp that a lot of the decks, the vast majority of decks, aren't spell-based decks, and it's basically just pile. So I don't know if it's really worth it to put spell rends in for that matchup. If there was a sideboard, this would be a great card to exist, and I still think it's a really cool card to exist in the game, but I don't know if it really... I just don't know if the metagame would ever shape up such that you would want to have this card in your deck. At least not more than maybe a 1 of. But definitely a cool card. Next up we have Spiteful Razorkinder. So, reveal for a clash, card's level is 10, and when it enters the battle zone, your opponent chooses and discards a card. So this card I don't think is really getting there. If I ever were to play this card, I would just want to play Fumes instead. Just because, like, if you're going this kind of direction, like, you're probably not having access to something like Spire Puppet. Like, this card, I would probably rather play Maddening Whispers as a control tool than this. And if I'm playing a more mid-rangey style deck, again, I'd probably just rather have Fumes, because it's probably going to be paired alongside Chronax or something like that, and Chronax really wants to have the format card that can curve into it like Fumes instead. So I just don't see this card really being a playable card, unfortunately. I mean, similar to all the other ones in this cycle, like, it has a good effect when it enters the battle zone. So it's like not the worst card, but compared to all the other options that exist in competitive Kaijudo, this card is just not really getting there. Kind of unfortunate, because I love Razorkinder as a character. Some of my favorite cards in the game have been Razorkinder Puppet, and the original Razorkinder are 2 of my favorite cards. Next up we have Stitched Spawn. So when it enters the battle zone, clash, and if you win the clash, one of your creatures gets Slayer. So on a 3-drop, I mean, it's a cheap way to give Slayer to something, which is kind of nice. So you can play it in like the mid game alongside something else. Like maybe you go Stitch Spawn plus blocker and then trade off a creature into an Evo. Like, that's pretty nice. But for the most part, I'd rather just have a 3-mana Slayer. Like, I'd rather just be playing Skullcutter or Rib Protector or Rib Collector, and then just drop that into play preemptively, rather than having to hold this card in my hand and wait to find a spot to deploy it. Like, I'd rather just deploy the Slayer. And when you can, and of course, that's all leaving aside the fact that it's a clash. Like, the card has a decent effect. Don't get me wrong; it's a decent effect, or a pretty solid effect. Like, that effect has been proven to be pretty good with the Chronax, but Chronax has a lot of other utility going for it as well. The untap creatures clause is super huge on Chronax, so not the most comparable there. I think it would definitely be a playable option as if it wasn't a clash, but the fact that it's a clash just makes it, I think, just not worth entertaining. So next up we have Unhinged Mimic. So 5 mana, 4,000 power blocker guard, and when it enters the battle zone, you can target an enemy creature, and it gets 1000 power reduction until the end of the turn. So this card, I think, as it is printed right here, I don't think it's playable. But if it was like a 4-mana 3000 blocker guard, I think it'd be an awesome addition to the game. I don't know how great it would be all told, but it would be like a much more defensive Scaradorable or Screeching Scaradorable, where it can pick off small creatures like Cyberscamp, but then it has a little more versatility in some spots where it can pick off just random bait creatures lying around like Manatic and things like Nyx. It can pick off those as a 4-mana card, and it's a blocker guard, which can be nice in those matchups as well, where it's sort of a trade-off. Like Screeching can pick off stuff like Lux. You can pick off different kind of 2-drops like Weaponized Razorcat, Metal Max, like those big ones. It can pick off Aqua Striders. So, and on top of that, while not being a blocker, it can at least revenge kill a lot of like the early drop rush stuff as well. So I think it would be like I think it would be a pretty playable card if it was 4-mana. In my opinion, like a 4-mana 3000, I think that would be like a playable option. You'd have to kind of see how the metagame shapes up, how many 1000 power creatures are out there. But I think it would be like a more defensive option, where Scaradorable or Screeching definitely has a little more offensive utility, being able to shut down blockers, and on top of that, just being an attacker. Like I think it's a little more offensive, but Unhinged Mimic I think would be it would be a cool card to exist and a nice option. I don't know how good it would be, like I said, but at 5 mana it just seems a little too expensive. But just because like a lot of the creatures you want to pick off, you need to do in that timely manner. Like if you're gonna play this, like I just don't really see this being like better than something like Shredmane, which at that point, like I would just probably play Shredmane, just because that being able to pick off that extra 1000 power worth of creatures, and then of course having the duality of the Slayer effect means Shredmane is like just always doing something pretty good. And even Shredmane I'm not super in love with as a card, but at 4 mana it just comes down so much quicker, does a much better job maybe unlocking your spells if you're facing down a Skyberscamp. If you're going first, you could, like, if you're playing a control deck, you could sprout into Unhinged Mimic on turn 4 and then play that and pick off a Cyberscamp that your opponent just played when they were going second. Like that would be a really nice curve. But at 4 mana, just unfortunate card that it's there. Would be a really cool tool for like some darkness control decks, mid-range decks. Virulent Worm, 6 mana 4000 Slayer. Yeah, no, just not something to be looking at. Void Primogen, this is a cool card. Definitely a kind of combo-esque clash card. So when it enters the battle zone, clash with your opponent. If you won the clash, you can put a non-evolution creature that's level 4 or less from your discard pile into the battle zone. So you can also just put itself in and just chain these off. So you could just play it. If you win the clash, you can keep going and just play all of the Void Primogens from your discard pile, which is really cool. I think a while back I played against a deck that LED, one of the members of the Rangers Dojo Discord, I played against a deck that he was playing with these Void Spawns, and he would just put out Primogens, and he would use things like Necros to recur them and then start off the chain again. But the problem with that was just you're really hinging on winning that clash to get things started every turn. Otherwise, like, you put out a creature, maybe you put out, like, it can be powerful because part of that combo was using Infernal Taskmaster to give them fast attack, and then they get banished at the end of the turn. So sweet idea. The problem is if you lose the first clash, it's going to be not great. So kind of unfortunate, but this card would probably be way too good if it just didn't have the clash restriction on it. But this is definitely a fun card. Like, this is one of the clash cards that kind of makes sense because it is like this cool thing where you build around it and then you're just like rubbing your hands together hoping something goes your way, and you kind of win the die roll on that clash effect, and you can do really cool stuff. So the sweats on this card are pretty sweet, and it would probably be a little too good if it didn't have the randomness to it. So next up we have the final darkness card, actually, Void Trap. So not really too playable. Target creature gets minus 3,000 power if it's on your opponent's turn, and if it's your turn, you give that creature minus 6,000 power. So this is just not really going to get there as a removal tool, in my opinion at least. Like 6 mana from hand, too expensive, and it kills too little when you're facing down high powerful evolution creatures. And you compare this card to like even stuff like Grievous Strike, you're probably not looking to play this card. Like, it's just a little bit too much underwhelming of a Shield Blast, and I think a little bit too underwhelming of a removal spell on your turn as well. So I don't think it really gets there in terms of constructed, but nice card for limited for sure. So when you look at darkness, I think my favorite cards, not too much sticks out. I really like the pairing of Necromancer and Master of the Graves, and I would really like to explore that sort of Darkness Rush variant or aggressive Darkness deck at the very least. So I think that combination of cards I think is really cool. Outside of that, I think the most exciting card, I mean, Spell Rend, I really like. Just, it's the kind of card I just like in the game of Kaijudo, but I don't know how playable it would really end up being in the metagame. So if we're talking like favorite cards or most interesting cards to me, I think Spell Rend would be up there as well. But just straight power level, I mean, there's not even that much that's that good. Like Anguish Haunt is a cool combination or combo card, and so is Void Primogen. But I don't. Void Primogen might be one of the stronger cards, but I don't think it actually gets there in the competitive environment. So definitely like the 2 Darkness Rush cards would be cool cards. Maybe this card could get into that Darkness Rush card deck as well, but if you're talking Darkness Rush, like I would already be wanting to play Master of the Graves, and I would already be wanting to play a number of these like expensive shield trigger creatures. So I think Void Primogen would just be a little bit too much top end. And when you're talking about a random clash effect in a rush deck that's filled with probably 9 1-drops, I don't think this card is going to get there consistently enough. So I don't know if that would make the cut, but definitely cool. So yeah, that should about do it for this darkness portion of the Eye of the Storm set review. As always, I hope you enjoyed the review and analysis. If you had any thoughts about any of these cards, any of them you thought were much better than I stated, or maybe much worse than I stated, or you have any of your own insight on these, it'd be awesome to hear that. Aside from that, thank you for watching the video, and we'll see you in the next episode in this series. Bye.